anybody know what biblical criticism is? Fast and loose definition.
Criticizing the Bible.
Good. Good. Criticizing the Bible. Being critical, right? So this comes from like the Enlightenment, right? Critical thought being the method by which we understand the universe. So in biblical studies, we quickly started applying Enlightenment philosophy, critical thought to biblical interpretation. When we hear this, we tend to think that it's negative, right? This sounds like people being critical of the Bible. But this is what all of us do. Because of our environment, the way that we're educated, the way that we learn, we all do this. This was not always how Christians approach the Bible. If you go through and read, man, like medieval interpretations of Scripture are bananas. It is crazy. So like the cross that Jesus died on is like a figure that walks around and talks and tells stories. And these like metaphorical interpretations of Scripture. It's bananas. I can't even express how crazy it is. And that was kind of the way that pre-modern interpreters read the Bible. Everything could be a metaphor for everything. It was just the Wild West of biblical interpretation, and that was how most of it functioned. For us, that seems kind of in the way that we're taught, that seems unbiblical, right? To take this random word that appears in the Gospel of Mark and extrapolate a whole, sermon or a whole chapter in your book about how this one word has 7 letters in the Greek and is therefore a metaphor for perfection, and build a whole thing off of it when that is not at all what's happening. And that's not even the text. And we would say that's not what Mark meant. That's not what his audience understood it to mean. And you're building this whole metaphor out of straw, And if you read this stuff, it's a lot of fun. So we all do this, right? And there are differing layers of this. There's differing methods of this. And I want to get into all the different aspects, all the different types of criticism that we can do, because some of you are already doing portions of biblical criticism in your papers. You just don't know it. And so I'm hoping that going through and talking about the different methods and the different criticisms will help you to realize, oh, this is what I'm doing. I should go and look at something about this type of criticism so that I can do it well, right? If this is already what I'm doing, I should be able to do it well. Good? So, we have this whole list of biblical criticism, and we're going to go through it, and it's going to end with modern day, right? So this developed since the Enlightenment all the way down to modern biblical criticisms, which I think some of us would disagree with, right? There's this middle road of most of us, I think within evangelical Christianity, we're on board with a lot of modern biblical criticism, and we tend to reject postmodern biblical criticism as a distinction, which all of these terms are based on stuff that's happening outside of Christianity, outside of biblical scholarship, where critical thinking and the Enlightenment is a thing, right? Modern thought is a thing, postmodern thought is a thing, all outside of Christianity, outside of biblical scholarship. And then those things are kind of injected into biblical scholarship, right? So biblical scholars see the stuff that's happening outside in the larger academic world, and they pull the tools that they're developing out there and use them on the Bible, right? I think some of us would agree with some of them and disagree with others. So we're going to get into that. And then at the end, we're going to talk about one of the kind of ways that it's applied, which is one of my favorite subjects, which is the synoptic problem. So that's kind of where we're headed. So biblical criticism, generally speaking, started with kind of 4 main topics that all fall under this idea of historical criticism. You can tell I didn't have time to write a whole slideshow for it, so we're writing a lot on the board. So historical criticism comes with textual criticism, with literary, source, and form criticism. So these are all kind of different types of criticism that fall under this umbrella of historical criticism, right? Which is all kind of under the big heading of all the different methods that we use to read and interpret the Bible. So I think all of us understand historical criticism. What is it talking about?
History.
Yeah, talking about the text existing in history, right? And the way that it developed in history, the way that it impacted history, etc. What do we talk about with textual criticism?
Like criticizing the text.
The text meaning what?
Like biblical text, historical text, any type of text that can relate to history that some people may question.
Okay. So that's good. I think specifically, so I think some of what you were talking about might fall under literary.
That's probably what
But textual criticism is focused on not just what the text means, but what is the text? Is the text every manuscript ever that's written for Gospel of John? Or textual criticism exists to refine our huge amount of manuscripts into one authoritative copy that we say is the original or the authoritative or the inspired tradition. So this is developing what is the text, right? And so it goes through a lot of the manuscript evidence, it looks at all the original languages and all the different fragments that we have and puts together an authoritative text. Then we get into the literary criticism, which I think might have been a little bit of what you were talking about, where we're looking at a lot of the stuff that we did last week and this week for our class. So we're looking at genre, and we're looking at composition, I like to think of literary criticism as English 101, right? Like your high school English class. This is the kind of stuff that you're doing. We've got this text. What is the meaning of the text? Part of this, I think, I guess it's still separated, is looking at source criticism, which, anybody have an idea? Good. So what sources, if any, are being used? Can anybody think of an example of biblical texts that have sources?
I guess like my passage has the awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, which is from the Old Testament, but not really.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of one of my favorite subtopics. All of this is huge areas of study. Every one of these, textual criticism is a massive area of scholarship. Literary criticism is massive because genre criticism is also a thing, and it fits into literary criticism, and genre criticism is a huge thing. Composition is a huge thing. So the New Testament use of the Old Testament is a massive area of scholarship. I like it a lot. This is the sort of stuff that I did when I was at Vandy. Looking at, so my work was looking at Isaiah 6 being interpreted in the New Testament. So Isaiah 6 is the most common quoted passage from Isaiah in the New Testament. It's quoted in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, it's in Acts, and it's kind of quoted in Romans. It's also quoted in the Quran. It's also quoted in the Book of Mormon. And so Isaiah 6 is just massive implications wherever it is. And so I looked at how John uses Isaiah 6 in a way that's different than how Matthew, Mark, and Luke use Isaiah 6. They're quoting the same passage, but they're using it differently. And so that's why you get this word use, right? They're applying the text from the Old Testament. They're using that source as a tool, something to further their argument. We also see Paul kind of uses Greco-Roman philosophers sometimes. He references folks that we kind of don't know who they are. And then you also have the synoptic problem falls into here, which we will circle back to talking about this more. But the synoptic problem, generally speaking, is what are the synoptics? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? Syn, S-Y-N, it means together, like synthesis, bringing something together. And optic is visual, right? So seeing together, seeing through the same lens. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you read through them, they read very similar, right? They have the same general chronology, they tell a lot of the same stories. And scholarship, once we get to this point in history, realize Matthew, Mark, and Luke have these massive passages that are word for word identical. So somehow they're using the same sources. And so the investigation began and the argument started of in what way are they using common sources or are they using each other as sources in order for them to get word for word the same stories, right? We'll come back to that. The last one is form criticism. Anybody have an idea about this?
Is it like, because it talks about this in our book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, what form does the text take? Like, is it poetry? Is it prose? Is it apocalyptic? Is it an epistle?
So I think what you're describing
Or
is
that's
genre. Form is kind of outside of the text. So these are like pre-literary forms. The idea is that there are these units in Scripture that exist kind of maybe before they got into being part of the Gospel of Mark. So there's a story that exists that's an oral tradition that's being told, and Mark puts the story in his text, right? So there's a form, there's a standard that is being put into the text. You see this sometimes where Matthew, Mark, and Luke will tell the same story, but it happens at different points in the chronology. Or in different manuscripts, they will have the same story, the same pericope, the same paragraph that is in the wrong spot. So it's the same manuscript, but there's one story that's just missing, and it's plugged in as a whole unit somewhere else. That's what form criticism is looking at, is the way that these stories were told and these forms existed prior to actually being written down. That sounds a little sketchy for us, I think, but we also have to realize that's how all of it happened, right? Especially when you get into the Old Testament, right? If we're going to say that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there's got to be a lot of oral tradition between Moses telling the story and it actually being written down, right? I don't know of anybody who argues that Moses wrote those books with his hand. I don't know of anybody, I'm sure there's somebody, who argues that he, took pen to paper or whatever it was, chisel to rock, and wrote the book of Genesis. When we say that he wrote Genesis, we mean that he crafted the original oral tradition that was passed on. And it wasn't actually written down until the exile, depending on who you ask. Some people say it's earlier, some people say it's later. But it's not actually written down until thousands of years after Moses, right? So it existed in forms. And part of this has to do with orality, meaning speaking, where we are a literate society. And when you think of, I love using this example, think of the word banana. How many of you picture a banana in your head? How many of you picture the letters B-A-N-A-N-A? Right? That is something unique to us as a society. That when we think of the word, we think of the letters, the symbols, right? The random markings that we as humans came up with that represent this long yellow fruit, right? That is, it's bananas, right? It's crazy for anyone who comes from a non-literate society, an oral society, right? They would not think of symbols, visual markers, to represent the thing. It's just the thing, right? And so an oral culture is very different than ours. So for them, the book of Genesis exists, and it is a set series of stories, even though it's never been written down. Right? Even though it doesn't exist as pen and paper, it is passed on, and it is guided, it's memorized, by enough people that the story itself is stable and can be passed from generation to generation through, the Egyptian enslavement. It can pass, and that story can remain, even though it's never been written down. And that is kind of lost on us. We don't really have categories for that because we don't value orality the way that oral cultures do. Does that make sense? So that's form criticism, looking at the way that it is, the way that these units, the way that these forms, the way that these stories exist before they're written down, outside of being written down. Any questions on any of this so far? Good. Erase my random banana word. We've got more types of criticism. These are the four main categories: textual, literary, source, and form. And they all kind of fall into this big historical umbrella. We have started to branch out as biblical scholarship away from focusing on the historical, because people started to argue, 50 years ago, that the Bible is treated differently than any other text because we examine so much of the history and focus on these ideas that we ignore reading the text for what the text is trying to say, right? We're so focused on the history and what's happening behind the text and what the sources are and the forms and whatever else that we are ignoring, okay, but what's the story saying? What does the text actually mean? So in response to this kind of big push, we have, several different things. We have narrative criticism. Narrative doesn't start with an M. And what is that looking at?
The narrative, the way that the narrative flows.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the idea is that the meaning of the text is not found in the history behind it, but in the narrative itself. The meaning of the text is found in the text. I think this is where a lot of us kind of camp out. We tend to try to live here, where we're just going to read the Bible for the Bible's sake, and we're going to read it maybe in light of other passages. If you're reading John 3, maybe you'll read a couple other chapters in John to help you understand John 3. Maybe you'll read all of John. Maybe you'll read the whole New Testament to help you build this narrative understanding. But the main idea is that John exists as a literary unit, as a standalone story, and you can get the meaning of John by reading John, right? I think a lot of us jive with that. What we also have is, so anybody see a problem with narrative criticism for what we're doing in this class, particularly with Ephesians?
You have to understand part of why, especially for Ephesians or letters, you have to understand why it's being written in order
Sure.
to understand and also it's not a narrative, it's a letter.
That's what I was thinking. Narrative has a specific connotation. So narrative criticism applies pretty largely to the Gospels and Acts, stories in the Old Testament, stories, right? There's not much narrative going on in Ephesians or Romans or whatever else. So we also have, I guess the way I understand it is, you can probably say that all of this belongs into literary criticism. But I would say a companion to narrative criticism is this idea of rhetorical criticism. And what is rhetorical criticism looking at? So, the rhetoric that's being used, and by rhetoric we mean the mode of argumentation. So, this is something that is very much helpful for Pauline letters, for letters in general. But also, I mean, Matthew decided to sit down and write a gospel for a reason. And he compiled it the way he did for a reason and presented stories in a certain order for a reason. And we tend to think of, well, Matthew was just writing history. And so he just wrote stuff the way he had to. And I don't think that's true, right? I think that part of what Matthew is doing is also rhetorical. That he's making an argument and building a case for a specific thing. For Matthew, I think his thing is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, right? That's why in Matthew you have, the story starts off with a baby who's escaping an evil king who's trying to kill all the babies by going into Egypt, right? Well, who does that sound like? Well, that's Moses, right? Moses was trying to escape the death of all the babies, and so they put him in water. And Jesus escapes with his family into Egypt, right? When Jesus comes out of Egypt, right? In Matthew it says, "Out of Egypt I call my son," which is a reference to the Exodus, right? Jesus comes out of Egypt, passes through water, right? He's baptized in the same way that the Israelites passed through the Jordan, the Red Sea, whatever it is, the Red Sea. And then where does Jesus go? In Matthew 3, he's baptized. In Matthew 4, he's tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. The Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years, right? And then, after Matthew 4, Jesus delivers his first message, his first meaningful thing, which is the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus comes out of the desert temptation, ascends a mountain, and gives a law, right? In the same way that the Israelites, Moses, they're in their temptation, Moses climbs Mount Sinai and receives a law, right? So the way that Matthew is crafting the story is shaped by the Old Testament, and it's trying to rhetorically show us that connection. Luke doesn't do that. Luke tells a lot of the same stories, but Luke's even Christmas narrative is focused on something different. What characters do we see in Luke's Christmas story that aren't in Matthew's? What's that? Okay.
Elizabeth
Uh-huh.
and, oh my gosh, I forgot his name.
Zechariah,
Yeah.
right? But John's dad, is that what you're talking about?
Mhm.
Yep. Luke also tells us about Simon, is that the super old guy in the temple who
Oh, yeah.
was like, I'm going to die any minute, but I'm going to see the Messiah first.
Mhm.
And then there's also like a temple, there's an old woman there too, Anna,
Mhm.
maybe, right? There's also shepherds that show up, and like the angels come and tell the shepherds, hey, there's this cool thing happening, you should go check it out. None of that happens in Matthew. So Matthew is focused on connecting Jesus' birth to the Old Testament. Luke is focused on connecting Jesus' birth to the marginalized, the people who've been overlooked, right? The shepherds who are out with the stinky sheep and aren't allowed to practice religion, and the old widows, and the people who are no longer allowed to practice, or the people who are no longer relevant, people who are barren, people who are powerless. And the gospel, Jesus, comes to those people. So Luke is also telling the birth narrative, but rhetorically doing a very different thing, right? So even though they're telling the story, the rhetoric is still important for the way they're shaping the story. Good? We'll get to that in a minute. So this is kind of where we're at. And I think most of this is types of criticism that all of us are on board with, if that makes sense. These are in by and large, evangelical circles, Christian circles, all of this is kosher. All of this is fine, right? There's also another type of criticism that probably should be, that probably should be up here at the level with historical criticism, which is social criticism. Social criticism focuses not on the history of the text, but on the social location where the text is being read, right? So it starts with the idea that all of us are shaped by our own social location, right? Our own experiences, the way that we've grown up, the way that our The things that have happened to us have shaped our lives. And it starts there. And develops tools to interpret the Bible based on that. Now, there are big circles within Christianity, Protestant, evangelical Christianity, who do not like a lot of this stuff. Because it starts at this point. It starts at the social, it starts with you, and does not start with the history of the text. It doesn't start with the text and pull meaning out of it. I'm not saying that all of this is eisegesis, inflicting your own meaning on the text, but that's what it's accused of. So be aware with these methods that we're talking about, that some of them are controversial. Does anybody know of any of these sort of criticisms? Stuff that people kind of don't like nowadays? I'm sure you'll know them once I write them. So all this kind of falls into the idea of postmodern criticism, where postmodern criticism kind of, outside of biblical scholarship, postmodern movement kind of came to the point of everything that we're learning in modern philosophy doesn't work. They kind of concluded, well, meaning itself is unattainable. And the whole idea of modern philosophy is to achieve meaning, and meaning is not possible. So we're going to develop something else because we can't actually get to the meaning of the original text. It's lost to us through history. And so they developed these, we want a meaning for the text for us because we can't actually get to the historical meaning of the text. So some of this is, I think one of the big ones would be feminist criticism, feminist readings of the text, looking at the text from the position of maybe not just a feminist, but a woman, and reading the text in that light. At first, so like for me personally, this seems very, you can't do that. This seems very wrong, like we're not allowed to do that. But then I actually sat down with, some of the work and some of the scholars who do this. And they point out stuff that was just completely lost to me on texts that I've read for years, right? So the idea of, one of the things that I got out of feminist criticism was, if you look at the New Testament, if you look at the gospel stories, there are women all over the place. They're always acting, they're always doing stuff. So many of them remain nameless, right? Where they do things and they seem like they're contributing a lot and they don't have a name. What are the names of the women that we do know?
Mary.
They're all named Mary, right? And when you read through the text, we kind of operating in this field, we conflate so many of the women into Mary, right? So there's several women that are named Mary. There's the Samaritan woman at the well. Well, let's just call her Mary too, right? There's Mary Magdalene. Let's call her Mary. She's the one who, poured the perfume out and wiped. But there's also this sinner in a different story, in a different gospel, and this sinful woman comes and she also anoints Jesus. Well, since she's anointing Jesus, she must also be Mary. It must be the same woman, right? And since this woman over here, we know that she's a sinner. Well, since she's a woman, the sin has to be sexual sin, right? It has to be. There's nothing, women can't sin in any other way than being prostitutes. So Mary Magdalene is now a prostitute. Because this other woman who, in the text, is not named Mary, was described as a sinner, which must mean a prostitute, which must mean that Mary's a prostitute. So now you're conflating all the characters in the story into Mary the Virgin Mother and Mary the whore, the prostitute, right? And that's the only categories that we have for women in the Gospels. And so when somebody explained that to me, and it's all through this lens, man, that blew up my whole interpretation, my whole understanding of, like, oh, there are these characters who are participating and are not being named, right? The woman caught in adultery. We call her that because we don't know her name, right? And if you read the story, the woman caught in adultery does not participate, right? Jesus is having an argument with the other men in front of her and about her, but she is not participating until everybody else has left, and then Jesus talks to her, right? But she is very much like, she's the discussion topic, right? She's not seen as a person. She's an opportunity for these men over here to argue with this man over here. So Some of this I have found very helpful. Some of it gets wonky. Some of it gets a bit much for me personally. But I think some of us might come from circles where any of this sort of stuff is just, we have to dismiss it out of hand. Maybe not, for me personally. Another aspect of this kind of a subcategory, if anybody's familiar, does anybody know the difference in feminist and womanist? Anybody? Take a guess.
Is that kind of like commentary, or they like, no, okay.
Complimentary, no.
Okay, so like, this is purely a guess.
Uh-huh.
So, feminist ideas usually are about like equality,
Okay.
being on the same level as womanist, like, oh, women are better.
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's a fun guess though.
That's a good guess, yeah.
That's
So,
fun.
feminism focuses on the female experience generally. Womanist theologies tend to focus on something called intersectionality, if you're familiar with that, where one identity that a person identifies themselves as intersects with another identity that they have. In this case, womanist theology, womanist criticism is particularly focused on women of color. So not just women, feminists, but women of color. I think it's mostly black women. I don't know that it is including Latina experience in this. I think it is specific to black women interpreting scripture from that lens. I could be wrong. But you can see how this is kind of like a subset of feminist criticism, feminist theology. We also have post-colonial criticism, which was big probably 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know how big it is now. Any idea what post-colonial means? Yeah, so after the whole world was interested in making colonies, right, which was like 200, 300 years of our, maybe it was actually probably more than that, of our existence. So now that we as a society have realized that colonizing other people is no longer the best way to behave, this is a series of criticisms and theologies and whatever that examines the Bible through the lens of empire, through power, through addressing issues like that, looking at what we talked about in our controversy a few weeks ago. When Paul says to submit to the governing authorities, he's telling you to submit to the empire, right? And now that we kind of exist in a society where collectively we're opposed to empires, right? People going out and conquering other lesser, poorer people. How do we interpret those passages in light of that? So that's a lot of this focus. And then we talked about this last week in our controversy. Queer theology and queer criticisms. It's not just, we have LGBTQ. It's not just the Q, it's the whole spectrum of LGBT issues. Looking at the text that we looked at the other day that discussed homosexuality, looking at the roles of marriage and children and family structures and all this sort of stuff from this particular social lens. So this is the kind of stuff we were talking about Matthew Vines. This is the lens, this is the criticism through which he would look at the text. Does that make sense? Good. So you can see why some of this, people in our circles would be opposed to some of these methods. They generally try not to say, well, this method is wrong and this method is fine, and parse it out. They tend to say social criticism, generally speaking, is wrong, because it starts from the social perspective of the person reading and not the historical perspective of the book being read.